There are places on Earth where silence feels heavier than sound. The open Atlantic is one of them. Miles from the nearest shore, beneath a sky with no landmarks and a horizon that seems to continue forever, a ship can become a world of its own. As creaking timbers become familiar, the wind in the rigging becomes a kind of clock. Footsteps across the deck tell you that other human beings are still there. And when those footsteps stop, the silence can become terrifying. On the 4th day of December, 1872, a British brigantine was sailing through the Atlantic when its crew noticed another vessel ahead. At first, there was nothing particularly strange about it. A ship alone at sea was hardly unusual. But as the vessel drew closer, the sailors aboard the Dei Gratia began to notice something that did not make sense. The ship ahead was moving. The sails were set. The hull was still afloat, but no one appeared to be controlling it. There were no sailors visible on deck. No one answered their signals. No figure appeared at the helm. The Dei Gratia's captain, David Morehouse, could only watch as the mysterious vessel drifted and rolled in the Atlantic swell. Eventually, men from the Dei Gratia climbed aboard, and what they found there would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history. The ship was the Mary Celeste. She was not sinking. She was not burning. She was not badly damaged. She was not a wreck. She was simply there. A ship designed to carry people across an ocean, still carrying its cargo, still carrying food and water, still carrying the personal possessions of those who had sailed aboard her. But the people themselves were gone. Every one of them. Captain Benjamin Briggs was missing. His wife, Sarah, was missing. Their young daughter, Sophia, was missing. And the 7 other members of the crew were missing as well. There was no clear explanation, no confirmed sighting, no message left behind explaining what had happened. No body was ever recovered. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the Mary Celeste had not been found abandoned near land. She was hundreds of miles from the nearest major port, in the middle of an enormous ocean. Tonight, on Shaded Past, we are going back to that ship. Not as a ghost story, not as a tale of monsters rising from the deep, but as a historical mystery. A story built from logbooks, testimony, court records, weather, navigation, cargo, human behavior, and the few fragile clues that survived. So let the room become quiet. Let the ocean replace the noise of the modern world. And imagine yourself standing on a wooden deck in the Atlantic in the winter of 1872. The wind is moving through the rigging. The sea rises and falls beneath you. Somewhere beyond the darkness, there is no land for hundreds of miles. And somewhere in that vastness, a ship is waiting. Before we reach the day of her disappearance, we have to understand the ship herself. Because the Mary Celeste was not born as the Mary Celeste. Her first name was Amazon. She was built in Nova Scotia in 1860, during an age when wooden sailing ships still carried an enormous share of the world's commerce. The 19th century Atlantic was a highway made of wind. Ships crossed it carrying timber, grain, machinery, passengers, manufactured goods, and countless other commodities. Their crews depended on experience, navigation, discipline, and luck. There were no engines powerful enough to guarantee a steady course.
No satellite navigation.
No radio communication. No weather forecasts delivered instantly from distant observatories. A captain could leave port with a reasonable understanding of the conditions ahead and still find himself facing a completely different ocean days later. The Amazon began her life in that world. She was a substantial wooden vessel, built for the difficult work of commercial sailing. But almost immediately, her history acquired an unfortunate reputation. During her early career, her first captain, Robert McClellan, became seriously ill and died shortly after the vessel's first voyage began. Command passed to another officer. Then came accidents. The Amazon was involved in a collision with another vessel. She suffered damage. She changed hands. Her early years were marked by enough misfortune that later writers would look backward and see a pattern. Cursed ship. A vessel born beneath an unlucky star. But history is rarely so neat. Wooden ships collided. Captains became ill. Cargo was damaged. Ships ran aground. The 19th century sea was dangerous enough that accidents did not require supernatural explanations. Still, the reputation followed her. And in time, the old Amazon would be repaired, renamed, and given another chance. In 1869, she became the Mary Celeste. By then, the world around her was changing rapidly. Steamships were becoming more important. Industrialization was transforming ports and cities. The Atlantic was becoming increasingly crowded with commerce. And yet the Mary Celeste remained part of an older maritime world, dependent on wind, canvas, rope, wood, and the judgment of the men who commanded her. Her new captain was Benjamin Briggs. Briggs was not an inexperienced sailor chasing adventure. He was a professional mariner from a seafaring family. He had spent years at sea. He knew ships. He knew the risks of Atlantic crossings. And he had something else that would make the story of the Mary Celeste especially painful. He intended this voyage to be a family voyage. His wife, Sarah, would accompany him. So would their young daughter, Sophia. For a captain, bringing one's family onto a commercial voyage was not a decision made casually. The ocean was unpredictable. But Briggs apparently believed the journey could be made safely. The voyage began in New York. The Mary Celeste was loaded with cargo intended for Genoa, Italy. Among that cargo were barrels of commercial alcohol. The shipment consisted of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, a cargo that would later become central to attempts to explain the disappearance. The vessel was provisioned. The crew was aboard. The captain and his family were aboard. And on November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor. There was nothing about the departure that suggested the voyage would become extraordinary. The ship moved eastward into the Atlantic. For the first part of the journey, everything appears to have been routine. The ocean was doing what oceans do. The vessel rose and fell with the waves. The crew worked. The captain navigated. The family lived aboard the ship. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of those days, a final ordinary chapter was being written. No one aboard knew it was the final chapter. The Mary Celeste continued toward the Azores. Those islands sit in the North Atlantic, far from the American coast and still hundreds of miles from mainland Europe. For sailors of the period, they were important landmarks in the Atlantic crossing. But they could also be surrounded by difficult weather. The ocean around the islands is exposed and unpredictable. Winds can shift. Swells can build. Storm systems can alter a voyage with little warning. And sometime after the Mary Celeste passed into that region, something happened. We do not know exactly what. That uncertainty is the heart of the mystery. The ship's log provides one of the most important pieces of evidence we possess. The final surviving entry was made on November 25th. It recorded the vessel's position and the progress of the voyage. There was no dramatic confession, no desperate warning, no message announcing an attack. Nothing that reads like the last page of a disaster. The entry was, in appearance, ordinary. And then the record stops. November 25th. The Mary Celeste disappears from the documentary record for several days. 9 days later, another ship would find her. But those 9 days are where the mystery lives. Imagine that gap. On one side, a captain is writing in his log. He is doing what generations of sailors had done before him. He is recording position. He is navigating. His wife and child are somewhere aboard the vessel. His crew is performing its duties. The ship is carrying valuable cargo. The destination is ahead. And then there is nothing.
No surviving witness.
No final entry. No reliable account of what happened. Only the ship itself. On December 4th, the Dei Gratia encountered her. The Dei Gratia had also sailed from New York, bound for Gibraltar and beyond. His crew knew the Atlantic. They knew how a sailing ship should look when properly handled. And the Mary Celeste did not look right. Her sails were set, but she was not being controlled properly. She was drifting unpredictably. From a distance, the men aboard the Dei Gratia could see enough to know that something was wrong. Captain Morehouse sent men across. Among them was the chief mate, Oliver Devoe. What they saw would become legendary, but the real scene was quieter than the legends suggest. There was no theatrical tableau of a meal still steaming on the table. There was no supernatural apparition. There was no obvious sign that everyone had vanished in the middle of a conversation. Instead, there was something much more unsettling. There was evidence of an ordinary voyage interrupted by something extraordinary. The ship had been abandoned, but it had not been completely stripped. The Mary Celeste still contained supplies. She still carried cargo. She still had valuable equipment. Her navigation instruments were not simply gone. Personal possessions remained. Clothing remained. The captain's papers were not all missing. The ship itself was in a condition that suggested she had not suffered the kind of catastrophic damage that would normally force everyone to abandon her. And yet the people were gone. The crew of the Dei Gratia examined the vessel carefully. There was water in the hold, but not enough to explain the abandonment. The pumps were not useless. The hull was not found shattered open. There was no obvious evidence of a devastating collision. The ship had experienced weather. There were signs of disorder. Some equipment had been damaged or lost. But nothing immediately explained why a seasoned captain would voluntarily leave the vessel. And that question is more important than the ghost story. Why would Benjamin Briggs leave? A captain in the 19th century understood something that modern people sometimes forget. A ship was safety. A lifeboat was exposure. To leave a seaworthy sailing vessel in the middle of the Atlantic was not a minor decision. It meant exchanging a relatively stable wooden platform for a small open boat. It meant exposure to wind, waves, cold, hunger, thirst, and the possibility of losing sight of the ship. The Mary Celeste could provide shelter. The lifeboat could not. So if Briggs ordered his family and crew into the boat, he must have believed that remaining aboard the Mary Celeste was more dangerous than leaving her. That single idea gives the mystery its shape. Something may have frightened the people aboard enough to make them abandon what appeared, afterward, to be the safer place. But what? The cargo is one possibility. The barrels of alcohol were not all in perfect condition. Some had leaked. And alcohol produces vapors. Under certain circumstances, flammable vapors can accumulate in confined spaces. A sudden release of pressure, fumes, or the fear of an explosion could have been terrifying to a crew trapped aboard a wooden ship carrying a large quantity of alcohol. But there is an important distinction between what could have happened and what the evidence proves. There is no confirmed record of a violent explosion aboard the Mary Celeste. No evidence establishes that an explosion occurred. And there is no surviving statement from Briggs explaining that he feared one. Still, the possibility has fascinated investigators for generations. Imagine being inside the ship. The hold is below your feet. The cargo is sealed in barrels. The smell of alcohol is strong. Perhaps you hear a strange noise. Perhaps you notice vapor. Perhaps you believe pressure is building. You cannot see what is happening inside the cargo hold. You cannot call another ship. You cannot radio for assistance. You have only your judgment. A captain has to make a decision. Stay aboard and risk an explosion. Or lower the lifeboat. The second choice could make sense if the captain believed the danger was temporary. Perhaps he imagined that everyone could remain near the ship until the situation stabilized. And this brings us to one of the strangest clues. The Mary Celeste's lifeboat was missing. If the people simply disappeared by supernatural means, the boat would not need to be explained. But if they deliberately left, then the boat becomes central. The people did not merely walk off the ship. They had to get away from it. There was also evidence suggesting a connection between the vessel and the missing boat. A length of line was associated with the ship. Later interpretations would imagine that the lifeboat may have remained attached to the Mary Celeste for some time. If that happened, the people in the boat may have believed they were still connected to their ship. They may have intended to remain close. That would make sense if the abandonment was temporary. The captain might think, wait until the danger passes, then return. But the Atlantic does not care what a captain intends. A rope can break. A sudden gust can separate vessels. A change in wind can create distance in minutes. A wave can make two boats impossible to control. And once a small boat loses contact with a larger ship, the difference between being near safety and being completely lost can become enormous. This is one possible explanation, but it remains an explanation, not a fact. That distinction matters, because the Mary Celeste has spent more than a century surrounded by stories that became more dramatic each time they were repeated. Some versions transformed the vessel into a floating haunted house. Some claimed that the food was still warm. Some claimed that a half-written message was found. Some described blood, violence, or signs of struggle that were never established by the official investigation. The real mystery is quieter, and in some ways more disturbing. The real ship did not need ghosts. It needed only one terrible misunderstanding, one sudden decision, one piece of equipment failing at the wrong moment. One moment when a captain believed he had to choose between two dangers. And perhaps after that choice, the ocean made the rest inevitable. But before we accept any theory, we have to return to the Mary Celeste herself. Because the condition of the ship was the first great clue. When the Dei Gratia crew boarded her, they found a vessel that had been through difficult weather but was still capable of sailing. Her sails and rigging were not in perfect condition. Some equipment was damaged or missing. The ship was not pristine, but she was not a shattered wreck. Her cargo was still aboard. The barrels of alcohol were still there. The ship's stores remained. There was food. There was water. And there was enough of the ordinary life of a voyage left behind to make the disappearance even harder to understand. The crew's personal belongings had not simply been gathered up and taken. This was not the appearance of a planned departure. The people had left quickly enough that they could not take everything. That tells us something, but it does not tell us why. And that is where the story becomes almost unbearably human. Because somewhere inside the ship were traces of a family. Sarah Briggs had been living aboard the vessel with her husband and their young daughter. Sophia was only 2 years old. A child on an Atlantic crossing would have required constant care. Her clothes, her possessions, the ordinary objects of childhood, all the small things that turn a wooden cabin into a home. Then there was Benjamin Briggs. He had responsibility not only for his ship and cargo, but for the people he had brought with him. If danger appeared, he had to make the decision. And his wife and daughter would be depending entirely on him. That changes the question. We are no longer asking simply why a crew abandoned a ship. We are asking what could have convinced a captain to remove his wife and 2-year-old daughter from the relative safety of a large vessel and place them into an open lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. Whatever happened, it had to be frightening. Or at least, Briggs had to believe it was. Perhaps he misjudged the danger. Perhaps the ship itself gave him misleading information. Perhaps the weather created a situation that looked worse than it truly was. Perhaps a combination of small problems became, in his mind, one enormous threat. That is how maritime disasters often begin. Not with one dramatic event, but with several ordinary problems arriving at exactly the wrong time. A damaged instrument, a shifting wind, water in the hold, a strange smell, a concern about cargo, a change in the sea. A captain trying to interpret incomplete information. And then a decision. The Mary Celeste gives us no final answer. But she gives us something else. She gives us a frozen moment from a vanished world. A wooden ship. A winter Atlantic. Family. A crew. A cargo of alcohol. And a lifeboat that was no longer there. The Dei Gratia crew eventually brought the abandoned vessel toward Gibraltar. The journey itself became part of the story, because the Mary Celeste did not sink. She did not disappear into a storm. She did not vanish beneath the waves. She arrived. A ship without the people who had sailed her. And when she reached Gibraltar, the mystery became a legal matter. The vessel had been salvaged. There was valuable cargo aboard. There were questions about ownership. There were questions about the fate of the missing people. And there was a far more uncomfortable question. Could the men who found the Mary Celeste have had something to do with the disappearance? That possibility could not simply be ignored. The ship had been found by another crew. The missing people were gone. The cargo was valuable. And the Atlantic leaves no witnesses behind. So the authorities began to investigate. What they discovered would make the Mary Celeste famous. But not because they found the answer. They became famous because they did not. The mystery survived the investigation. And every theory that came afterward would have to confront the same stubborn facts. The ship was found afloat. The people were missing. The cargo remained. The lifeboat was gone. And there was no convincing explanation for why a captain with years of experience would abandon a vessel that still had a chance of carrying him and his family to safety. For now, let the question remain unanswered. The Mary Celeste is still drifting somewhere in the imagination. Her sails are still full of wind. Her deck is still empty. And somewhere beyond the last entry in Benjamin Briggs's logbook, the story changes from history into mystery. The final days of the voyage are waiting, and the ocean has kept them silent. The Mary Celeste had been found, but finding the ship did not mean finding the truth. In fact, the moment she reached Gibraltar, the mystery became more complicated. A ship without its captain was already strange. A ship without its entire crew was almost impossible to explain. And a ship that appeared to have survived the Atlantic well enough to continue sailing raised an uncomfortable question for everyone who examined her. Why had anyone left? The Mary Celeste was taken into the harbor at Gibraltar, where officials began the process of examining the vessel. This was not the beginning of a ghost story. It was an investigation. People wanted facts. They wanted to know whether the missing crew had been victims of foul play. They wanted to know whether the Dei Gratia crew had discovered an opportunity for profit and somehow taken advantage of it. They wanted to know whether the ship itself had suffered some hidden disaster. And they wanted to know where Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, little Sophia, and the 7 sailors had gone. The first suspicion was understandable. Perhaps there had been violence, a mutiny, a fight, piracy, murder. Perhaps the crew had turned against their captain. Perhaps strangers had boarded the ship. Perhaps the people aboard the Mary Celeste had killed one another before abandoning the vessel. In the 19th century, the ocean was a place where such possibilities could not simply be dismissed. There were no cameras, no radio logs,
No satellite tracking. No automatic distress signals.
A ship could disappear and leave behind almost nothing. So investigators looked for physical evidence. Blood. Weapons. Signs of struggle. Damage suggesting a violent confrontation. Anything that might tell them that the people aboard had been attacked. But the evidence did not provide the dramatic answer people hoped to find. There was no confirmed scene of mass violence.
No bodies. No obvious massacre.
No clear evidence that pirates had boarded the ship. And yet suspicion remained, because the absence of evidence is not always evidence of innocence. It was possible that something had happened without leaving an obvious trace. But the more investigators examined the ship, the more another possibility began to emerge. Perhaps the people had left willingly. That sounds simple, but it creates an even greater mystery. Why? A ship at sea is a community with its own hierarchy. The captain gives orders. The crew follows them. The vessel itself becomes the center of everyone's survival. If the captain says the ship must be abandoned, experienced sailors do not casually agree. They would know the risks. They would understand that the lifeboat was not a comfortable alternative. So perhaps the captain had believed there was an immediate danger. The question then becomes, what kind of danger could make the Mary Celeste appear more frightening than an open Atlantic? One clue was inside the hold. The cargo. 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol had been loaded in New York. Alcohol was valuable. It was also dangerous. Some barrels were found to have leaked. This detail would become one of the most enduring theories about the mystery. To understand why, we have to imagine the technology of the time. A 19th century sailing ship did not have a modern ventilation system. The cargo hold was an enclosed environment beneath the deck. Barrels could leak. Vapors could accumulate. And a captain who knew he was carrying a large quantity of alcohol would have understood the possibility of fire. Even without an explosion actually occurring, the smell of alcohol vapor could have been alarming. A sudden release of pressure from a barrel might also create a loud sound. And a loud sound from beneath the deck could be terrifying if you did not know what caused it. Now imagine Briggs below deck. Perhaps he notices the smell. Perhaps he sees evidence of leakage. Perhaps he hears a sudden boom. He does not know whether the next sound will be louder. He has his wife and young daughter aboard. His crew is watching him. He has to decide. Stay. Or leave. The theory suggests that he might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily. Not because he believed the Mary Celeste was doomed, but because he feared she might be. If the threat was an explosion, distance could mean survival. And if the ship remained intact, they could return. That would explain something otherwise difficult to understand. The abandonment may not have been intended to be permanent. It may have been an emergency measure. That distinction is crucial. A captain who intends to abandon a ship forever would normally take essential navigation equipment, supplies, and other items. A captain who believes he is leaving for only a short time might take far less. He might even leave valuable objects behind. The Mary Celeste contained evidence consistent with a hurried departure. But again, consistency is not proof. We cannot step back into that day. We cannot hear the sound that may have frightened Briggs. We cannot smell the hold. We cannot see the sea conditions. We cannot ask the captain what he believed he was seeing. All we have are traces, and traces can be interpreted in more than one way. Another important detail was the ship's water. When the Dei Gratia crew boarded her, there was water in the hold. Several feet of water in a wooden ship sounds alarming to a modern listener. But the amount alone does not prove the Mary Celeste was sinking. Wooden sailing ships could take on water. Pumps existed for precisely that reason. And the pumps aboard the Mary Celeste were found to be usable. This matters because a serious leak might have been one of the reasons for abandonment. If Briggs believed the ship was filling with water faster than the crew could remove it, he could have concluded that the vessel was becoming unsafe. But later examination did not show a catastrophic flooding event. The Mary Celeste remained afloat. She was able to continue her voyage. So perhaps the water was not the real problem. Or perhaps the problem was not the amount of water itself. Perhaps Briggs did not know how much water was coming in. Perhaps an instrument gave him reason to believe the situation was worse than it was. Perhaps the ship had been damaged below the waterline. Perhaps the weather had made it difficult to determine the extent of the problem. Again, uncertainty surrounds every possibility. This is why the Mary Celeste remains so difficult. Almost every theory can explain one clue. Very few can explain all of them. Consider the navigation equipment. Some important items were missing from the ship. That suggests that at least some decisions had been made deliberately. People did not simply evaporate. Someone prepared to leave. Someone took the lifeboat. Someone moved from the ship to the smaller vessel. And someone made decisions about what to take with them. That is an important human footprint. The mystery is not that nobody acted. The mystery is that we do not know what they believed they were doing. This is the difference between the Mary Celeste and a conventional shipwreck. In a shipwreck, the evidence often points toward a single event. A storm, collision, a reef, a fire. The ship breaks. People fight to survive. The wreck remains. With the Mary Celeste, the ship itself survived. The people did not. That reversal is what makes the story so haunting. The object survived its voyage. The humans disappeared. And the vessel continued to move across the Atlantic as if nothing had happened. Imagine the hours immediately before the abandonment. We do not know what time it was. We do not know who first noticed a problem. We do not know whether the crew was frightened. We do not know whether Sarah Briggs understood the danger. We do not know whether Sophia was asleep. We do not know whether the crew expected to return within minutes. But we can reconstruct the setting. The Atlantic was around them. The ship's wooden structure creaked with the motion of the waves. Ropes pulled against blocks. Canvas shifted overhead. The hold contained barrels of alcohol. The cabins contained the belongings of a family. And somewhere on deck, Benjamin Briggs was making a decision. A decision that would outlive him. Perhaps he looked at the sea. Perhaps he looked at his ship. Perhaps he thought about his daughter. Then perhaps he ordered the lifeboat lowered. The boat would have been tiny compared with the Mary Celeste. Even in calm conditions, climbing down from a sailing ship into a small boat was not simple. In rough weather, it could be dangerous. The family would have needed help. The crew would have needed to transfer themselves carefully. And once everyone was aboard, the ship would still be there. At least, that may have been the plan. The Mary Celeste was not necessarily supposed to be abandoned forever. If the danger was temporary, the lifeboat could remain close. A line could connect the two vessels. The people could wait. The captain could watch his ship. Then, when the danger passed, everyone could return. But the Atlantic contains a brutal truth. Distance can appear slowly and then become enormous. A boat tied to a larger vessel is at the mercy of both. The ship rises on one wave. The boat drops into the next trough. The line becomes tight, then slack, then tight again. With strains, rope stretches. A sudden gust pushes the Mary Celeste away. The lifeboat moves differently, and suddenly the line is under tremendous pressure. If it breaks, the people in the small boat have a problem. They may still be able to see the Mary Celeste, but seeing a ship is not the same as reaching it. The distance can grow. The ship can become smaller. The horizon can swallow it. And then the largest object in the world to the people aboard the lifeboat becomes a tiny shape disappearing into the distance. If this happened, it would explain the empty ship. But it would not explain where the lifeboat eventually went. The ocean never returned it. No confirmed wreckage carrying the missing people was found. No reliable survivor ever appeared. The mystery, therefore, has two disappearances. The Mary Celeste's people vanished, and the lifeboat vanished with them. That is why the theory of accidental separation is both compelling and incomplete. It explains the ship. It does not explain the final fate of the people. Perhaps they died at sea. Perhaps the lifeboat overturned. Perhaps they were separated from the ship and never found again. In 1872, a small boat could disappear without leaving a trace. The Atlantic is enormous. Search technology was primitive, and weather could erase evidence quickly. But there were other possibilities. Some theories focused on the sea itself. The Azores region is not always gentle. Underwater earthquakes can generate disturbances. Sudden waves can appear. A seaquake could potentially frighten a crew or damage a vessel without leaving the kind of dramatic destruction associated with a full storm. If the Mary Celeste had experienced an unusual wave or underwater disturbance, perhaps the crew believed the ship was badly damaged. Perhaps they thought she was taking on too much water. Perhaps the captain feared a second wave. But again, there is no surviving evidence that a seaquake occurred at precisely the right time. It remains a possibility, not a conclusion. Other explanations have been even more exotic. Some stories claimed the crew encountered a sea monster. Giant squid became part of the mythology. The idea is easy to imagine. A mysterious creature beneath the Atlantic. A ship suddenly attacked. Sailors terrified. A family disappears. But there is no credible evidence that a giant squid attacked the Mary Celeste. The ocean itself is mysterious enough without adding monsters. And the real tragedy of the story is that no supernatural explanation is necessary. Human beings can make decisions under fear. And sometimes those decisions have consequences that cannot be reversed. Another strange possibility comes from the atmosphere. Sailors can experience optical illusions at sea. One of the most famous is the Fata Morgana. This phenomenon can distort distant objects through atmospheric refraction. Ships can appear suspended above the horizon. Objects can be stretched. Shapes can seem to move in impossible ways. But there is a temptation in mysteries to use such phenomena as explanations simply because they sound mysterious. The Fata Morgana could alter perception, could not, by itself, remove 9 people from a ship. So it may be interesting background. It is not an answer. The same is true of stories about hallucinations. Exhaustion, isolation, fear, and unusual environmental conditions can affect judgment. But there is no evidence that the entire crew experienced a shared hallucination. Again, the strongest explanations are usually the ones that require the fewest assumptions. And perhaps the most important assumption is this: Benjamin Briggs was not trying to disappear. He was trying to survive. That possibility changes the entire emotional shape of the story. If Briggs believed the ship was dangerous, he may have been acting exactly as a responsible captain should. He may have made what appeared to be the safest decision available. And that decision may have been catastrophically wrong. This is not unique to maritime history. Many disasters begin with people responding rationally to incomplete information. Pilot sees a warning. A captain sees rising water. A firefighter sees smoke. A doctor sees an unfamiliar symptom. The person has seconds or minutes to interpret what is happening. The outcome depends on what they believe the danger is. Briggs had no modern instruments, no weather radar, no radio, no way to call another vessel instantly. His information was limited to what he could see, hear, smell, and measure, and the ocean was surrounding him in every direction. Perhaps he believed he had only minutes. Perhaps he believed the Mary Celeste was about to explode. Perhaps he believed she was sinking. Perhaps he feared the ship had suffered structural damage. Or perhaps something else entirely had happened. There is another clue that has received enormous attention: the ship's chronometer. Navigation in the 19th century depended heavily on accurate instruments. A ship's position could be estimated through celestial navigation. But time mattered. An accurate marine chronometer allowed navigators to calculate longitude. If an instrument was damaged or missing, the captain's ability to determine his precise location could be compromised. Some accounts suggest that important navigation equipment was removed when the people left. If Briggs took the instruments with him, that would make sense. He expected to navigate the lifeboat. He may have believed they would soon return to the ship. That detail again points toward an emergency departure rather than a carefully planned abandonment. But even here, we must be cautious. Later retellings of the Mary Celeste often blur the line between what was recorded during the investigation and what was added by storytellers. The further the story traveled, the more details appeared. Some were exaggerated. Some were invented. Some were simply repeated so often that they began to sound like established facts. One of the most famous claims is that a meal was found on the table, still warm, as if everyone had vanished moments before the Dei Gratia arrived. That is almost certainly an embellishment. The real ship was not discovered only minutes after the disappearance. Days had passed. The ocean had continued moving. The weather had continued changing. Any food left aboard would have been affected by the passage of time. The truth is less cinematic, and yet it is more haunting. The crew of the Dei Gratia did not discover a supernatural tableau. They discovered the remains of an ordinary life, a vessel that had been occupied, then suddenly had not. Personal possessions,
Cargo.
equipment, cabins. The traces of human beings who had been there only days earlier, and nothing explaining where they had gone. That is enough. It does not need a steaming plate. It does not need blood on the walls. It does not need a ghost standing at the wheel. The empty bunks were enough. The abandoned ship was enough. The missing lifeboat was enough. And above all, the absence of an answer was enough. The official investigation in Gibraltar became increasingly suspicious. The salvage process itself had to be examined. Could the men from the Dei Gratia have harmed the crew and then staged the discovery? It was an obvious question. If the Mary Celeste carried valuable cargo, there was potential financial motivation. The authorities therefore had reason to look closely at the salvers. The ship was searched. The condition of the cargo was considered. The physical evidence was examined. And the investigators looked for signs that the Mary Celeste had been deliberately abandoned under suspicious circumstances. Some details were troubling. There were indications of damage. There were marks that could be interpreted in different ways. The ship was not in perfect condition. But none of this produced a clear narrative of murder. No convincing chain of evidence connected the Dei Gratia crew to the disappearance. The suspicion gradually weakened, and once the investigators could not prove foul play, the mystery remained. The people were still missing. The lifeboat was still missing. The ship was still there. And Benjamin Briggs was still absent. His wife and daughter were absent with him. For a captain, losing a ship is tragic. For a family, losing a father is devastating. For the Mary Celeste, the two tragedies became inseparable. The vessel became famous. The people became names. Benjamin, Sarah, Sophia, and 7 sailors whose lives were suddenly reduced to a question mark. It is easy, after more than a century, to treat them as characters in a mystery. But they were not characters. They were real people. They had families waiting for them. They had letters. They had belongings. They had plans for what would happen after Genoa. They believed they were going somewhere. Benjamin Briggs expected to reach Italy. Sarah Briggs expected to continue her life with her husband. Sophia was simply a 2-year-old child aboard a ship with her parents. The sailors had signed onto a voyage. None of them expected to become part of maritime folklore. That human dimension is often lost when the story is told as a ghost ship. The Mary Celeste was not merely a mystery. It was a disaster whose final moments were never witnessed. And that means every explanation must eventually confront the same painful possibility. Whatever happened, everyone aboard may have died. Not dramatically, not necessarily in a single event, but somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps in a small boat on a dark Atlantic Sea. The ocean may have erased the final chapter. Still, there was one more remarkable fact. The Mary Celeste continued her journey. A crew from another ship had to take responsibility for bringing her toward safety. The abandoned vessel was not simply left to drift. She was sailed. She was delivered. And eventually, she became part of the legal and commercial machinery of salvage. A ship that had begun the voyage with 10 people aboard was now moving under the control of strangers. Her captain was gone. Her family was gone. Her crew was gone. But her cargo remained, and the ship herself continued toward Gibraltar. There is something almost cruel about that. The Mary Celeste completed more of the journey than the people who had sailed her. She crossed the ocean. They did not. And as she entered Gibraltar, the story changed again. The mysterious vessel that had been found in the Atlantic became evidence. Every object aboard could potentially tell a story. Every damaged rope, every barrel, every missing piece of equipment, every item left behind. The investigators had to reconstruct an event they had not witnessed. It was a kind of 19th century forensic puzzle, and they had almost no direct evidence.
No há witness. No surviving victim.
No final message.
No recovered lifeboat.
Only a ship. A ship that seemed to say everything was fine, and an empty space where the people should have been. That contradiction would follow the Mary Celeste for the rest of her life, because even after the investigation ended, the story did not. New theories appeared. Writers added details. Newspapers embellished the mystery. The public became fascinated by the idea of a ghost ship sailing alone through the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste became something larger than the actual event. She became a symbol of the fear of the sea, a symbol of unexplained disappearance, a symbol of the moment when ordinary life ends and nobody knows why. But before the legend grows any larger, we need to go deeper into the evidence. Because the most interesting clues are not the sensational ones. They are the small details, the things that were present, the things that were missing, the things that had been moved, the things that had been left untouched, and the things that later generations misunderstood. One of those details concerns the ship's cargo. The alcohol barrels were not all behaving the same way. Some were damaged. Some leaked. This matters because alcohol vapor is highly flammable. But it also creates a problem for the explosion theory. If there had been a massive explosion inside the hold, why was the ship still standing? Why was the cargo not destroyed? Why was there no clear evidence of a catastrophic fire? The answer proposed by some later investigators is more subtle. Perhaps there was a pressure event rather than a full explosion. Perhaps vapors escaped. Perhaps a sudden noise frightened the crew without causing serious structural damage. Such an event could have created the impression of danger. And perception matters. A captain does not need to know that a ship is actually doomed. He only needs to believe that it might be. That is enough to change a decision. And once the lifeboat was launched, the consequences may have been irreversible. This is why the Mary Celeste remains so frustrating to historians. The simplest explanation may not be one spectacular event. It may be a chain, a series of small problems, cargo issue, a concern about water, a change in weather, a navigation problem, a frightened crew, a captain making a temporary decision, a line connecting the boats, then one moment of separation. After that, the ocean. That chain requires no monster,
No pirate fleet.
no supernatural force, only human judgment under pressure. But we still cannot prove it. And until we can, the Mary Celeste remains exactly what it has always been. A question. The final answer disappeared with the people aboard, and the ocean has never returned it. For now, the Mary Celeste remains in the darkness. Her empty deck rises and falls with the Atlantic. Her sails move in the wind. Her cargo sits below, and the last known position of her captain remains fixed in an old logbook. But the next part of the story is stranger still. Because the Mary Celeste did not disappear after the mystery. She continued to exist. She continued to sail. She changed hands. She survived years beyond the disappearance. And eventually, she met a fate almost as strange as the one that made her famous. The ghost ship had not yet finished her story. The ghost ship had not yet finished her story. But by the time the Mary Celeste sailed away from Gibraltar, the people who had once made her a home were already becoming memories. Benjamin Briggs was gone. Sarah was gone. Little Sophia was gone. The crew was gone. And the vessel that carried them had become one of the most famous ships in the world. Yet fame did not make the mystery easier. It made it harder. Because every new telling of the story added another layer between the historical Mary Celeste and the Mary Celeste of imagination. To understand what happened, we have to strip those layers away. We have to return to what can actually be known. The ship was discovered on December 4th, 1872. The final surviving log entry was dated November 25th. Between those dates lies the central darkness. 9 days. 9 days in which the ship continued across the Atlantic without leaving us a reliable human account of what happened. 9 days in which weather moved across the sea. 9 days in which the crew lived without knowing they would become famous. 9 days in which ordinary decisions may have slowly led toward an extraordinary disappearance. There is something strangely powerful about that gap. If the final log entry had described a catastrophe, the mystery would be smaller. If Briggs had written that the ship was sinking, we would know. If he had recorded an attack, we would know. If he had written that an explosion had occurred, we would have a starting point. But he did none of those things. His final entry was ordinary, and then silence. That silence has encouraged generations of people to imagine what might have happened. Some imagine a sudden storm. Others imagine a fire. Some imagine an explosion. Others imagine a seaquake. Some imagine a desperate struggle. And a few imagine something beyond nature. But there is another possibility. Perhaps nothing spectacular happened at all. Perhaps the disappearance was caused by a sequence of small events that seemed insignificant until they combined. This is often how disasters unfold. A ship does not need to encounter a monster. It only needs to encounter uncertainty. A captain might notice that the ship is taking on more water than expected. He might worry about a cargo that could produce dangerous fumes. He might question whether an instrument is giving an accurate reading. He might see rough weather approaching. Each problem alone might be manageable. Together, they could become terrifying. And then comes the human factor. A captain must decide before he knows everything. Benjamin Briggs had no luxury of waiting for perfect information. The ocean does not provide perfect information. It provides waves, wind, cloud, darkness, sound, and fragments. A sailor has to build a picture of reality from those fragments. Sometimes the picture is correct. Sometimes it is not. And the consequences can be enormous. Consider the possibility of water in the hold. A few feet of water inside a wooden vessel sounds like an emergency. But ships of the period routinely dealt with water. Wood flexes. Seams can admit small amounts. Waves can wash across the deck. Pumps exist because water inside a ship is not automatically evidence of disaster. The Mary Celeste's pumps were apparently still usable. That suggests the vessel was not helpless. But imagine being the captain and not knowing precisely why the water is there. You are in the middle of the ocean. You cannot see the bottom of the hull. You cannot simply pull into the nearest harbor. If the water is rising, every minute matters. And if the ship is also carrying volatile cargo, your concern becomes greater. The captain does not need certainty. He needs to decide what risk he is willing to take. That is where the Mary Celeste becomes a story about judgment. Perhaps Briggs judged that leaving temporarily was safer. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps he intended to return. Perhaps the lifeboat remained connected. Perhaps the line broke. Or perhaps the people aboard encountered an entirely different danger. We simply do not know. But there is another important question. Why would the entire group leave? Captain might leave first. But why would the crew follow? The answer may be simple. Because the captain was responsible for the ship. If Briggs believed the vessel was dangerous, his crew would have had strong reason to trust him. They were sailors. They understood the risks. If the captain ordered them into the boat, they would have known that the order was serious. And among those people was Briggs's own family. His wife and child would not have had the same experience of the sea as the professional sailors. That makes the decision even more significant. The family could not simply be expected to survive in a lifeboat for days. So if the boat was launched, the intention was probably not to drift indefinitely across the Atlantic. It may have been to remain close to the ship. Perhaps the plan was to wait. Perhaps they intended to inspect the vessel from a distance. Perhaps they expected to reboard shortly. That would make the disappearance tragically simple. A temporary decision became permanent. A line failed. A boat drifted. A ship continued. And the Atlantic separated them. There is no way to know whether that is what happened. But it is one of the few theories that fits the psychological reality of the situation. The people did not necessarily need to believe they were abandoning the ship forever. They may have believed they were stepping away from danger for only a few minutes. That is a very different decision. It is also a decision that could be made quickly. And quick decisions leave things behind. Clothing, papers, personal possessions, food, equipment. The things that later investigators found aboard the Mary Celeste. That is why the apparent disorder of the ship matters. Not because it proves panic, but because it suggests the departure was not a normal voyage to shore. Nobody packed for a journey. Nobody emptied the cabins. Nobody removed everything of value. The ship was left as though its occupants expected to return. That is one of the most haunting possibilities of all. Maybe they thought they would return. Maybe they never imagined that the Mary Celeste would continue without them. Imagine Sarah Briggs in the small boat, her husband nearby, her 2-year-old daughter with her, the Mary Celeste only a short distance away, the crew working to keep the boat steady. Perhaps everyone was watching the ship. Perhaps the line between them was tight. Perhaps they were waiting for something. Then imagine a sudden change. A wave. A gust. A snap. The line breaks. The Mary Celeste begins moving away. At first, perhaps nobody panics. The ship is still visible. But the distance increases. Someone rows. Someone tries to control the boat. The wind is against them. The ship's sails catch more air. The horizon expands. The vessel becomes smaller. And the people realize that what was supposed to be temporary may have become irreversible. This is only an imagined reconstruction. There is no evidence that we can place ourselves inside that scene with certainty. But it illustrates how little would have been required for a temporary abandonment to become fatal. The Atlantic does not need to be violent. It only needs to be bigger than the people trying to cross it. And the Atlantic is enormous. The Mary Celeste was found roughly 400 nautical miles east of the Azores. The people in a small boat would have faced one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. No engine. Limited supplies. Limited shelter. No radio. No reliable way to signal another vessel. A small boat could disappear into the horizon without anyone knowing where it went. Even a search would have been extraordinarily difficult. That is one reason the absence of bodies does not necessarily indicate murder. The ocean can remove evidence. A boat can overturn. People can die of exposure. A wreck can sink. Currents can carry debris far from the original location. In 1872, there was no system capable of tracking a lifeboat across an empty ocean. The disappearance could therefore remain permanent even if the cause was entirely ordinary. But the mystery was not finished. The Mary Celeste still had a future. She returned to commercial service. Her reputation followed her. People knew the story. Sailors knew the name. The ship became associated with disappearance. A vessel that had once been simply a working brigantine was now a legend. And legends change the way people see ordinary events. A strange sound becomes a supernatural omen. A damaged rope becomes evidence of a struggle. A missing object becomes proof of a conspiracy. A ship's bad luck becomes a curse. This happened to the Mary Celeste. Her earlier accidents were suddenly reinterpreted. The old Amazon became part of the legend. Her captain's death, her collisions, her misfortunes, all were gathered together into a narrative. The ship seemed cursed. But ships do not have personalities. People give them personalities. The ocean encourages this. A ship is a home surrounded by darkness. Sailors spend weeks or months aboard it. They learn its noises. They know which boards creak. They know how the rigging sounds in different winds. They can recognize problems from vibrations. A ship becomes almost alive in the minds of the people who sail her. When the people disappear, the ship seems to have survived them. That creates the illusion that the vessel itself is the witness. The Mary Celeste appears to know what happened, but she cannot speak. She only carries clues, and some of those clues are surprisingly mundane. The cargo, the pumps, the sails, the navigation instruments, the personal possessions, the lifeboat, the rope, the condition of the deck. None of these objects tells the whole story, but together they create boundaries around what might have happened. For example, the absence of obvious catastrophic damage makes some explanations less likely. A massive fire would normally leave unmistakable evidence. A devastating explosion would likely cause severe structural damage. A collision with another large vessel would usually leave marks. A violent pirate attack would likely leave signs of struggle. But the Mary Celeste did not present itself as a ship destroyed by any of these events. That does not mean none occurred. It means the evidence is not strong enough to establish them. And that is why the alcohol theory has remained popular. It offers a way to frighten the crew without destroying the ship. A sudden release of alcohol vapor could have produced a loud sound. The crew might have believed an explosion was imminent. The captain could have ordered everyone into the lifeboat. Then the ship could have remained intact. From the perspective of someone who did not know the future, that decision could have seemed reasonable. But the theory has limitations. There is no surviving evidence that Briggs actually believed an explosion was about to occur. No note says so. No crew member survived to describe it. No eyewitness account confirms the smell, the sound, or the captain's reaction. So the theory remains plausible but unproven. This distinction is important because the Mary Celeste is often presented as though modern science has solved her. It has not. Science can tell us what alcohol vapor does, can tell us how wooden ships behave, can tell us how currents move, can tell us how weather affects sailing vessels. It can evaluate whether certain scenarios are physically possible. But science cannot recreate a missing human decision unless enough evidence survives. The mystery is partly physical, but it is also psychological. We are trying to understand what people believed at a moment we cannot observe. That is much harder. Suppose Briggs saw a small amount of water. Suppose he smelled alcohol. Suppose the sea became rough. Suppose he believed the ship might explode. Each fact might have been real, but the final decision would depend on his interpretation. And interpretation is invisible. The Mary Celeste therefore sits at the intersection of physics and human judgment. The ship gives us measurable evidence. The missing people take the rest with them. Another possibility has sometimes been raised. Perhaps the crew mutinied. Perhaps there was a confrontation between sailors and captain. But there is little evidence for such a scenario. A mutiny normally leaves a reason, a struggle, a change in command, pattern of violence. Here, the central problem remains the same. If the crew wanted to take the ship, why abandon it? If they wanted to escape the captain, why leave the vessel behind? If they killed one another, where are the bodies? The theory creates more questions than it answers. Piracy has similar problems. Pirates wanted valuable cargo. The Mary Celeste carried cargo. Yet the cargo remained. The ship itself remained. The pirates would have had little reason to remove everyone and then leave a valuable vessel drifting. A pirate attack is therefore difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence. The same is true of deliberate sabotage. Someone could have wanted the ship to appear abandoned. But again, why? Who benefited? What was the motive? The missing people had no known reason to disappear voluntarily. The simplest explanation is usually that they did not intend to disappear, that they believed they were doing something temporary. That is perhaps the most important idea in the entire mystery. They may have expected to return. If so, the Mary Celeste was not abandoned. It was temporarily separated from its people. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. A person leaving a ship permanently takes supplies. A person leaving for a few minutes may take only what seems immediately necessary. A person expecting to return leaves possessions behind. A person planning to disappear does not. The objects left aboard the Mary Celeste therefore may tell us something about intention. They may suggest that the people believed their absence would be brief. But then the question becomes, what caused the brief absence to become permanent? The answer may be hidden in the missing lifeboat. That boat was the bridge between the two worlds, the ship and the ocean. The people stepped into the boat. The boat separated from the ship. And somewhere after that moment, the trail ends. If the boat had been found, the mystery might have been solved. If a sailor had survived, we would know. If a body had washed ashore, we might have had a clue. But nothing certain emerged. That absence created space for legend. And legend loves empty space. For more than a century, the Mary Celeste has been filled with stories. Ghost stories, monster stories, murder stories, curse stories, scientific theories. Each generation finds its own explanation. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that the mystery has survived not because the evidence is abundant. It has survived because the evidence is incomplete. We know just enough to imagine the scene, not enough to prove what happened. That is a powerful combination. It allows the mind to enter the gap. And when the mind enters a historical gap, it tends to fill it. One person imagines pirates. Another imagines an explosion. Another imagines a storm. Another imagines a supernatural event. The Mary Celeste becomes whatever the storyteller needs her to be. But beneath all those stories is a real ship, a real family, real sailors, a real voyage, and a real loss. The ship's subsequent history is less famous than the disappearance, but it is worth following. Because the Mary Celeste did not immediately become a museum piece. She continued to sail. She was bought and sold. She carried cargo. She remained a working vessel. This is another reminder that ships are objects. The people who sail them can become legends. The vessel itself continues. Wood can be repaired. Sails can be replaced. Names can change. Owners can change. The sea does not care about reputation. The Mary Celeste continued to face the same physical world that had existed before her mystery. Winds, currents, storms, reefs, and human decisions. Years passed. The original disappearance became older. The people who had known Benjamin Briggs began to die. A new generation encountered the story without knowing the people. The event moved from memory into history, then from history into folklore. The distinction between the two became increasingly blurred. Stories about the ship appeared in newspapers and popular literature. The mysterious vessel was irresistible. A ship found drifting without its crew was exactly the kind of story that captured the imagination of the public. And as the story spread, certain details became exaggerated. The Mary Celeste was no longer simply a ship with missing people. She became the ghost ship. The phrase itself was powerful. It transformed a historical mystery into a supernatural image. A ship with no crew. A ship sailing alone. A ship carrying the dead. A ship condemned to wander forever. But none of that is what the evidence actually tells us. The Mary Celeste did not literally sail forever. She was brought to port. She was examined. She was returned to service. She had crews after the disappearance. Her story was not a supernatural curse. It was an unresolved human event. That distinction is worth preserving. Because real history is often stranger than fiction precisely because it refuses to provide a satisfying ending. A fictional story gives us an answer. The villain is revealed. The monster is defeated. The mystery closes. History does not promise that. Sometimes the evidence simply ends. And when it does, we have to live with uncertainty. The Mary Celeste is one of history's most famous examples of that uncertainty. Still, the ship's later years brought more trouble. Her reputation made her unusual. But reputation could not protect her from the ordinary risks of commerce. Eventually, a new chapter began. One that would lead the Mary Celeste toward her final voyage. By then, the mystery was already famous. The ship was no longer just another sailing vessel. She was the ship everyone knew. The ship that had lost her people. The ship whose empty cabins had become famous. The ship that seemed to carry an invisible story wherever she went. And yet she continued. That is one of the strangest aspects of her history. The Mary Celeste survived the event that made her famous. The people did not. Years later, the vessel would finally meet a fate that was much easier to understand. Not a disappearance. Not a supernatural event. Not a mystery. A wreck. A reef. And the slow destruction of an old wooden ship. But before we reach that ending, there is still one more question. What exactly did the investigators see when they examined the Mary Celeste? And what did later generations get wrong? Because somewhere between the original evidence and the famous legend, the story changed. A meal that was never necessarily warm became a symbol. A ship that was not destroyed became a haunted vessel. A missing crew became a supernatural disappearance. And the ordinary objects left behind became clues in a mystery that no one could solve. To understand the Mary Celeste, we have to separate the ship from the myth. We have to look again at the evidence. The cabin. The hold. The pumps. The cargo. The navigation equipment. The missing lifeboat. The rope. The weather. And the final entry in the log. Each one is a piece. None is the whole picture. But perhaps, when placed together, they can bring us closer to the moment when the Mary Celeste became empty. And perhaps the answer is not hidden in something extraordinary. Perhaps it is hidden in something painfully ordinary. A frightened captain. A temporary decision. A small boat. A length of rope. And an ocean that was simply too large. The Mary Celeste had left behind a trail of clues. But clues are not answers. And perhaps that is why the mystery has survived for so long. A century after the disappearance, people would still argue over the same questions. What frightened Benjamin Briggs? Why did he leave the ship? Why did he take the people with him? Why was the lifeboat gone? And where did the boat disappear? The temptation is always to search for one dramatic explanation, one event, one moment, one secret, but the evidence may point towards something more complicated. The Mary Celeste was a working ship in an unforgiving environment. Her captain was experienced, but experience does not eliminate uncertainty. Her crew was competent, but competence does not control the ocean. And her cargo was valuable, but valuable cargo can also become a source of fear. The ship had several conditions that could have caused concern. There was water in the hold. There were damaged or leaking barrels. There were problems with some equipment. There was weather. There was the ordinary uncertainty of navigation. None of these facts by itself explains the disappearance. But perhaps the disappearance did not require one fact. Perhaps it required only one moment in which several concerns converged. Imagine the pressure on Briggs. He is responsible for the vessel. He is responsible for the cargo. He is responsible for his crew. And his wife and daughter are aboard. Every captain knows that the safety of the people comes first. If he believed the ship was becoming dangerous, he had to act. And if he believed the danger was temporary, he might not want to abandon the ship completely. That creates the possibility of a lifeboat decision. Leave the ship. Stay close. Wait. Return. It sounds simple, but the ocean can turn simple plans into disasters. The rope connecting a lifeboat to a ship is not a permanent connection. It is a fragile link between two moving objects. The Mary Celeste was larger, heavier, driven by wind through her sails. The lifeboat was small, light, more vulnerable to every movement of the sea. If the line broke, the people could be carried away. And if the Mary Celeste continued moving, the separation could happen quickly. There is another possibility. Perhaps the line was deliberately cut. If the captain believed the ship itself was becoming dangerous, he might have wanted distance. Again, there is no certainty. But the presence of a line is important because it suggests a relationship between the two vessels. The lifeboat was not simply launched and forgotten. Someone may have expected to remain connected. That supports the idea of a temporary evacuation. Yet there is another problem. If Briggs had planned to remain near the ship, why did he not simply stay aboard? Because perhaps he believed the ship was unsafe. That is the paradox. The Mary Celeste appeared safe enough for the Dei Gratia crew to board her. But Briggs may not have known that. He was making his decision in real time. The crew of the Dei Gratia had the advantage of hindsight. They saw a ship that had survived. Briggs saw a ship whose condition was uncertain. Those are two very different things. This is an important lesson when studying historical disasters. We often judge decisions using information that became available afterward. But the people making the decisions did not have that information. Briggs did not know that another ship would find the Mary Celeste days later. He did not know that the vessel would remain afloat. He did not know that his decision would become famous. He only knew what he believed at that moment. If he thought the ship was in danger, abandoning her may have seemed rational. That does not mean the decision was correct. It means it was understandable. And perhaps that is the tragedy. A good captain can make a reasonable decision and still lose everyone. The ocean does not reward good intentions. It only responds to physics, wind, water, distance, weight, current, temperature, and time. If the Mary Celeste's crew entered the lifeboat intending to return, time may have been the enemy. A few minutes become an hour becomes several. The ship moves. The boat moves. The wind changes. The line weakens. And eventually, the people are no longer where they expected to be. That possibility also explains why so many possessions remained aboard. They may not have thought they were leaving permanently. If Sarah Briggs believed she would be back soon, there would be no reason to gather everything. If the crew believed the ship would be safe, they would leave their belongings. If the captain believed the emergency would pass, he might take only the essentials. The ship could therefore look strangely normal after the disappearance. Because, from the perspective of the people who left, it may have been a temporary absence. This is one of the strongest ideas surrounding the case. But there is another question. Why did nobody return? The answer may be the most difficult part. Once the lifeboat was separated from the ship, the people aboard had almost no chance of finding their way back. The Mary Celeste was a large sailing vessel. The lifeboat was small. A distant ship can disappear over the horizon even when it is only a few miles away. The curvature of the earth matters. Waves block visibility. Fog can erase a vessel. Night can make a ship invisible. And wind can carry two vessels in completely different directions. A person can lose sight of a ship without realizing how far away they have drifted. Once the Mary Celeste disappeared from view, the people in the boat would have faced a terrifying reality. They were alone, and they had no way to know whether another ship would pass. The Atlantic shipping routes were busy compared with earlier centuries, but the ocean was still enormous. A ship might pass within a relatively short distance and never see a small lifeboat. The people could shout. They could signal. They could raise an object. But from the deck of a distant ship, the boat might look like nothing more than a wave. That is the cruel mathematics of the sea. A human being can be alive and visible, and still be effectively invisible. Exposure would then become a threat. Cold, dehydration, hunger, waves, fatigue. If the lifeboat capsized, the story could end in minutes. If it remained upright, survival might last longer. But the outcome would still be uncertain. And without a recovered boat or survivor, we cannot know. This is where the mystery becomes less romantic. The ghost ship is fascinating. But the likely human reality, whatever the exact cause, may have been devastating. A family in a small boat. A child only 2 years old. A crew trying to keep the boat steady. An ocean stretching in every direction. And no certainty that anyone would ever find them. The disappearance may therefore have been less like a supernatural vanishing and more like an ordinary maritime tragedy whose final moments were never witnessed. But the legend prefers something stranger. The legend wants a curse. And the Mary Celeste had the perfect ingredients for one. An unlucky history. Captain who vanished. Family who vanished. A crew who vanished. A ship found sailing alone.
A mysterious cargo.
An empty cabin. An open logbook. And an ocean. It was irresistible. The old name Amazon became part of the mythology. People remembered her earlier accidents. They connected unrelated events. They treated coincidence as evidence. The ship had suffered misfortune before. Therefore, they reasoned perhaps she was cursed. But ships have long histories of accidents. If we look backward far enough, almost any old vessel can appear cursed. The Mary Celeste simply had one extraordinary event that made every earlier accident seem significant. That is how patterns are created. Once we know the ending, the earlier events begin to look like warnings. The first captain's death becomes an omen. The collisions become evidence. The repairs become suspicious. The name change becomes symbolic. But none of those things caused the disappearance. They are simply part of the ship's history. The real mystery began in late 1872, and it ended for the people aboard somewhere in the Atlantic. The investigation at Gibraltar also produced another important lesson. The investigators did not immediately accept the supernatural. They considered practical explanations. They looked at the ship. They examined the cargo. They questioned the salvors. They searched for evidence of violence. They tried to understand what could have happened. This matters because the modern image of the Mary Celeste sometimes suggests that nobody ever investigated seriously. They did. The problem was not a lack of investigation. The problem was a lack of evidence. The evidence did not reveal the final answer. And that is different. An investigation can be thorough and still fail. Sometimes the missing information is simply gone. The sea had already taken it. No forensic laboratory could recreate the exact sequence of events. No witness remained. The evidence aboard the ship could only tell investigators what was true after the disappearance. Could not tell them what happened immediately before it. That distinction is enormous. The Mary Celeste was a crime scene without a crime that could be proved. A disaster scene without a known disaster. A ship without survivors. The investigation could examine the result, but not the moment that created it. And that is why later theories became so important. Every generation tried to fill the gap. One theory suggested piracy, another mutiny, another alcohol vapor, another bad weather, another seaquake, another accidental separation, another supernatural explanation. Some theories were more plausible than others, but none could establish the truth. The alcohol theory deserves special attention because it is one of the few explanations grounded in a real physical danger. Alcohol vapor can ignite. Leaking barrels can create fumes. A sudden pressure release can be frightening. And a captain might react conservatively when his family is aboard. But there is a problem. The evidence does not show a catastrophic explosion. The ship remained intact. The cargo was largely recoverable. And there was no clear sign of a massive fire. So if alcohol played a role, it may have been through fear rather than destruction. Perhaps the crew believed an explosion was possible. That is different from an explosion actually happening. And that distinction may explain why the theory has survived. It does not require the ship to have been destroyed. It only requires the people aboard to have believed they were in danger. This brings us back to psychology. Fear does not always require proof. A strange noise at night can make a house feel dangerous. A warning signal can make a machine appear more threatening than it is. A smell can suggest a fire before any flame is visible. A captain who sees a possible danger has to decide before certainty arrives. Briggs may have chosen caution, and caution may have killed him. That is one of the most tragic possibilities. The decision to leave may have been made precisely because he was trying to protect his family. If so, the Mary Celeste was not a story about foolishness. It was a story about the terrible limits of human knowledge. A man had to choose. He chose. And we know only the outcome. We do not know what he saw. There is another theory worth examining. Could the crew have been overwhelmed by alcohol fumes themselves? Perhaps intoxication or illness caused confusion. Again, the evidence is weak. There is no reliable record that the entire crew became incapacitated. The theory does not explain why they would all enter the lifeboat. And it does not explain the final fate of the boat. It is possible that cargo contributed to the situation. But there is no reason to treat it as proven. This is the pattern that appears again and again. One theory explains one clue, then fails on another. The mystery survives in the spaces between them. The same is true of weather. A storm can explain why a captain might fear the ship, but the ship was not found wrecked. A seaquake can explain sudden fear, but there is no confirmed event. A leak can explain concern, but not necessarily abandonment. Alcohol can explain panic, but not the disappearance. A rope can explain separation, but not the exact cause. The final answer may therefore be a combination. Perhaps several small events created one enormous misunderstanding. That possibility is less satisfying than a single dramatic explanation. But history is often less satisfying than fiction. Real disasters are messy. They contain uncertainty. They contain human error. They contain coincidence. And they often end without witnesses. The Mary Celeste is no different. As the years passed, the ship continued to sail. But the legend followed her. Every unusual incident became suspicious. Every damaged piece of equipment became a possible clue. Every later misfortune seemed to confirm the curse. This is another psychological trap. Once a ship has a reputation for bad luck, people remember the bad events and forget the ordinary ones. The Mary Celeste may have completed many routine voyages without incident. Those voyages did not make newspapers. The strange events did. That creates a distorted picture. A ship appears cursed because only the unusual parts of its history are remembered. The same thing happens with famous people, places, and families. Once a story exists, new events are interpreted through it. The Mary Celeste became a legend before her final wreck. And legends can change reality. Eventually, the old wooden vessel was no longer the strong commercial ship she had once been. Age affects everything. Wood deteriorates. Repairs accumulate. Owners change. Cargo changes. The maritime world itself changes. Steam power becomes more common.
Navigation in progress.
Commercial routes evolve. The age that created the Mary Celeste slowly disappears. But the ship remains. A relic of an older Atlantic. A vessel from a world in which a captain could sail for weeks without speaking to anyone beyond his own crew. A world in which the ocean could separate people from civilization with terrifying ease. A world in which a small boat could vanish without leaving a reliable trace. That world is difficult for modern people to imagine. Today, if a ship loses contact, satellites can track it. Emergency beacons can transmit. Aircraft can search. Coast guards can coordinate. Weather systems can be monitored from space. A vessel can be located with extraordinary precision. But in 1872, the ocean was still enormous. A missing lifeboat could simply become part of the sea. And that makes the Mary Celeste easier to understand. Not less mysterious, but more understandable. The people did not need to encounter anything supernatural. They only needed to lose their ship. And once they did, the chances of recovery were small. The mystery also has an emotional dimension that is often overlooked. The people aboard the Mary Celeste did not know that their story would survive. They did not know that strangers would study their final days. They did not know that writers would speculate about their deaths. They did not know that their ship would become a cultural symbol. They were simply trying to reach Genoa, a destination, port. A normal end to a normal voyage. Perhaps Sarah imagined seeing land again. Perhaps Benjamin imagined completing his cargo delivery. Perhaps Sophia's childhood continued in the rhythm of the ship. The crew probably thought about wages, home, food, family, the ordinary future, and then something happened. Whatever it was, their future stopped. The Mary Celeste continued. That contrast is perhaps the saddest image in the entire story. The ship reached land. The people did not. The cargo arrived. The family did not. The vessel entered history. The people entered uncertainty. And the ocean kept the difference. Years later, the Mary Celeste would finally meet her end near Haiti. She was no longer the mysterious vessel discovered in the Atlantic. She was an aging ship. Her owners tried to make money from her. Her condition declined. And in an attempt to end her commercial life, she was involved in a deliberately disastrous voyage. The vessel was run aground on a reef near Haiti. Her cargo was not valuable enough to justify her continued operation. The old wooden ship was effectively sacrificed. And there, near the Caribbean, the Mary Celeste's physical story came close to its end. There is a strange symmetry in that. She had begun with accidents. She had survived collisions. She had survived the disappearance. She had survived years of sailing beneath the shadow of the legend. And finally, she met a reef. No ghost was required.
No mystery. No vanishing.
just an old ship reaching the end of her useful life. But the legend had already escaped. The Mary Celeste no longer belonged to the ocean alone. She belonged to history, and once a mystery enters history, it can survive far longer than the objects involved. The ship can rot. The wood can disappear. The sails can vanish. The people who remember the event can die. But the question remains: what happened? That question has survived because there is no final answer. And perhaps there never will be. The Atlantic does not return everything it takes. Some stories end beneath the waves. Some end in the silence between two logbook entries. Some end with a broken rope. And some end with an empty ship. The Mary Celeste may have been one of those stories. But before we leave her, there is one final place we need to visit. Not the deck. Not the hold. Not the lifeboat. But the imagination. Because the Mary Celeste became famous not only because of what happened, but because of what people believed happened. Her legend tells us something about ourselves. Why do we fear abandoned places? Why does an empty room feel different when we know someone should be there? Why does a ship drifting without a crew feel almost alive? Perhaps because humans are deeply uncomfortable with unexplained absence. We expect causes. We expect endings. When someone disappears, the mind searches for a story. It wants to know where they went. It wants to know why. It wants to know who is responsible. The Mary Celeste gives us none of those things. She gives us an empty deck, an empty cabin, an empty lifeboat davit, and a horizon. That is why the story is so powerful. There is no monster to defeat, no murderer to catch, no villain to expose, only uncertainty. And uncertainty can be more frightening than any answer. For more than 100 years, the Mary Celeste has sailed through books, newspapers, documentaries, novels, and dreams. Each retelling adds another wave, another layer, another possibility. But beneath the legend, the historical core remains remarkably simple. A ship left New York. A captain sailed with his family. A crew accompanied him. The voyage continued toward Italy. A final log entry was written. Days later, another ship found the Mary Celeste abandoned. The people were gone. The lifeboat was gone. The ship remained. No confirmed explanation ever solved the disappearance. Everything else grows from that. And perhaps that is where we should leave the story. Not with a monster, not with a curse, not with certainty, but with the possibility that the truth was painfully ordinary. Captain saw danger. He tried to protect the people aboard. He ordered them into a small boat. He believed they would return. Then something went wrong. A rope broke. Current shifted. A wind changed. The ship moved away, and the Atlantic became the final witness. We may never know, but the absence itself has become part of history. Benjamin Briggs remains at sea. Sarah remains at sea. Sophia remains at sea. The crew remains at sea. Not literally, perhaps, but in the imagination of every person who hears this story. They are forever approaching the edge of that final decision. Forever standing aboard a ship in the winter Atlantic. Forever looking toward the water. Forever believing there is still time to return. And perhaps that is why the Mary Celeste has never truly disappeared. The ship was eventually broken apart. The wood was consumed by weather and time. The vessel that once crossed the Atlantic no longer sails. But the story remains. It moves from one generation to another like a current beneath the surface. Quiet. Persistent. Impossible to see from above. And tonight, as we close this chapter, the ocean can become quiet again. The waves settle. The wind softens. The rigging stops creaking. The empty deck lies beneath the stars.
No voices. No footsteps.
No captain at the wheel, only the sea. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the Atlantic stretches into darkness, there is still a question waiting. What happened to the Mary Celeste? Perhaps the sea knows. Perhaps the sea has always known, but it has never spoken. And perhaps that silence is the final mystery. The Mary Celeste did not need to become a ghost ship. She became something stranger, a reminder that history sometimes leaves us with everything except the one thing we want most: the answer. So let the ship drift now. Let the waves carry her farther into the darkness. The lanterns grow dim. The horizon disappears. The old Atlantic becomes still. And the Mary Celeste, at last, becomes only a shadow beneath the stars. There is one final thing to understand about the Mary Celeste. The mystery did not end when the investigation ended. In some ways, that was when it truly began. The investigators could examine the ship. They could question the people who found her. They could inspect the cargo. They could search for evidence. But they could not examine the moment of disappearance. That moment had already passed into the ocean. And without a witness, every explanation remained incomplete. Perhaps that is why the Mary Celeste has remained so powerful for so long. Most mysteries eventually become stories with answers. A document is discovered. A confession appears. A body is found. A new piece of evidence closes the gap. But sometimes history refuses to cooperate. Sometimes the final page is missing. And when the final page is missing, people begin writing their own. The Mary Celeste became a blank page. Into that page, generations wrote storms, pirates, mutiny, explosions, seaquakes, monsters, ghosts, and curses. But the more we examine the historical evidence, the less we need those dramatic explanations. The mystery can remain mysterious without becoming supernatural. The people aboard the Mary Celeste may have faced a danger they misunderstood. They may have made a temporary evacuation. They may have expected to return. And something may have separated them from the ship. That explanation is not proven. But it is important because it respects the evidence. It does not require a hidden army of pirates. It does not require a sea monster. It does not require the ship itself to possess some supernatural force. It requires only a captain making a decision in the middle of the Atlantic. And sometimes the most frightening historical events begin with decisions that seem reasonable at the time. Benjamin Briggs was not a fictional character. He was a captain with experience. He had a wife. He had a young daughter. He had a crew who trusted him enough to cross the ocean. He had responsibilities. And he had a ship. When something seemed wrong, he had to act. We will never know exactly what he believed. But we can understand the world in which he made that decision. The 19th century Atlantic was a place of enormous distances. Ships depended on wind. Navigation depended on instruments and celestial observations. Communication depended on physical contact. A vessel could be alone for days, sometimes weeks. There was no instant assistance, no emergency helicopter, no satellite phone, no digital map showing the nearest ship. If something went wrong, the people aboard were largely on their own. That changes the meaning of risk. A modern sailor can call for help. Briggs could not. If he suspected a serious problem, his options were limited. Stay aboard. Try to repair it. Or leave. And leaving a ship in the open ocean was itself an enormous risk. The lifeboat was not a modern rescue craft. It was not designed to provide guaranteed survival. It was a fragile wooden platform surrounded by an ocean that could change without warning. The people aboard may have known this. They may have feared it. But perhaps they believed the ship itself was more dangerous. That is the central paradox. The Mary Celeste was eventually found seaworthy enough to continue. But that tells us nothing about what Briggs believed before he left. A person can escape a building because they smell smoke, only to discover later that there was no fire. The decision to leave was still understandable. The danger does not have to be real. It only has to appear real. That is why the mystery cannot be solved by examining the ship alone. We need the missing human perspective. And that perspective is exactly what history lost. The logbook stops. The voices stop. The lifeboat disappears. The trail ends. Perhaps there was a final conversation. Perhaps Briggs gave an order. Perhaps Sarah asked what was happening. Perhaps one of the sailors questioned the decision. Perhaps Sophia was frightened. Perhaps she was simply unaware of the danger. These moments are unknowable. They belong to the 9 days between the final log entry and the discovery. We should resist the temptation to invent them. The Mary Celeste deserves mystery without fiction being presented as fact. That distinction is especially important because the real story is already extraordinary. A family crossing the Atlantic. A ship carrying hundreds of barrels of alcohol. A captain recording the voyage. A sudden disappearance. A second ship discovering the vessel. And an empty ocean where the missing people should have been. Nothing more is required. The mystery is complete. The answer is simply absent. And perhaps that is why the Mary Celeste became a symbol of the unknown. The sea has always occupied a special place in human imagination. Land gives us boundaries. Mountains give us horizons. Cities give us lights. But the ocean can make a person feel very small. It stretches beyond sight. Its depths are hidden. Its currents are invisible. Its weather can change. And its surface can look calm while enormous forces move beneath it. A ship is a small human structure placed inside that vastness. It gives us the illusion of control. We build a deck. We raise sails. We draw routes on charts. We name the vessel. We give commands. We believe we are going somewhere. But the ocean remains larger. The Mary Celeste reminds us of that. She is a story about a ship. But underneath it, she is a story about limits. The limits of technology. The limits of knowledge. The limits of human judgment. And the limits of memory. Because after more than a century, even the memory of the event has become uncertain. We know the basic outline, but details have been exaggerated. Some stories claim the ship was discovered with a meal still warm. That detail became famous because it creates an immediate image. A table. Plates. Food. Then nothing. But history does not support the cinematic version so neatly. The reality was less dramatic, and perhaps more believable. The ship had been empty long enough for the sea and weather to continue their work. The food story belongs more to the mythology than the evidence. The same thing happened with other details. Later accounts sometimes transformed minor damage into evidence of violence. Ordinary maritime wear became suspicious. The ship's earlier accidents became part of a curse. The disappearance became a supernatural event. This is how folklore develops. It begins with something real. Then each generation adds another layer. The Mary Celeste started as a ship. Then she became a mystery. Then a ghost ship. Then a legend. Then a symbol. But if we strip everything away, the original tragedy remains. People disappeared. That is enough. The most important names are still the simplest. Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, Sophia Briggs, and the sailors who sailed with them. They deserve to remain more than characters in a ghost story. They were people with ordinary hopes. Briggs had a career. Sarah had a family. Sophia had barely begun her life. The sailors had homes and families of their own. Perhaps letters were waiting for them. Perhaps people expected to see them again. Perhaps someone was watching the harbor for the ship's return. That is another part of the tragedy that the legend can obscure. When a person disappears at sea, the loss is not limited to the people aboard. There are people on land who wait. They wait for letters. They wait for news. They wait for ships to arrive. And eventually they realize that the person they expected may never return. For the families of the Mary Celeste's crew, the mystery was not entertainment. It was absence. And absence can be harder to accept than death. Death has a finality. Disappearance leaves questions. Where are they? Did they suffer? Were they rescued? Could they still be alive? What happened? The Mary Celeste created exactly that kind of uncertainty. And because no definitive evidence ever emerged, the questions survived. There is another reason the case remains relevant. It demonstrates how history works when evidence is incomplete. Historians are not detectives with unlimited access to the past. They work with fragments, documents, objects, records, testimony, sometimes photographs, sometimes nothing. The Mary Celeste offers almost all the wrong kinds of evidence. We have the ship, but not the people. We have the log, but not the final account. We have the cargo, but not the captain's interpretation of it. We have the lifeboat's absence, but not its final destination. We have an investigation, but not a witness. This is why certainty is impossible. And acknowledging uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of honest history. We can say what is known. We can say what is plausible. And we can say what cannot be established. The alcohol theory is plausible. The temporary evacuation theory is plausible. Accidental separation is plausible. But none can be presented as the final answer. The same applies to natural phenomena. A seaquake could have contributed. Weather could have contributed. Water in the hold could have contributed. A combination of factors could have contributed. But without direct evidence, we cannot know. The mystery remains open, and perhaps it should remain open, because there is a strange beauty in the fact that some questions resist closure. Not every historical event can be reconstructed. Not every disappearance leaves a map. Not every final moment can be recorded. Sometimes the past ends with silence. The Mary Celeste is one of those silences. And now the ship itself is gone. The physical Mary Celeste no longer drifts through the Atlantic. Her wood has disappeared. Her sails are gone. Her fittings are scattered or lost. The vessel that once carried Benjamin Briggs and his family survives mainly through records and imagination. But perhaps the absence of the ship has made the story stronger. If the Mary Celeste still existed, she would be an object. Something we could touch, measure, photograph, study. Instead, she is almost entirely memory, a name, a logbook, a collection of reports, a mystery, and the image of an empty ship on a gray Atlantic morning. That image is difficult to forget. A vessel moving without voices, sails catching the wind, no captain, no crew, no family, only the sea. The Dei Gratia sailors could not have known what the ship would become. They were simply trying to understand what they had found. Imagine approaching the Mary Celeste. You see the vessel ahead. At first, you expect people. You expect movement. Someone on deck. Someone at the helm. Perhaps a sailor waving. But there is nothing. You call out. No answer. You move closer. Still nothing. The wind moves through the rigging. The ship rises and falls with the swell. You climb aboard. The deck is real. The wood is real. The cargo is real. The cabins are real. Everything suggests human presence. Yet no humans are there. That moment must have been deeply unsettling. Not because the ship was haunted, because it was normal. Normal enough to make the absence more disturbing. A completely destroyed ship tells you what happened. An empty ship leaves you guessing. That is the power of the Mary Celeste. The mystery exists in the contrast between order and absence. The vessel was not reduced to wreckage. It was not consumed by fire. It was not scattered across a reef. It was simply missing the people who belonged there. And perhaps that is why the ship feels almost like a room after someone has suddenly left. The chair remains. The clothes remain. The objects remain. But the person is gone. A person's belongings can make their absence more powerful. The object is evidence that someone existed. The empty room becomes a reminder. The Mary Celeste was an enormous empty room floating on the ocean. And the ocean outside was endless. That image alone could have created a legend. Everything else came later. Today, when we hear the phrase ghost ship, we often imagine something supernatural. A vessel covered in mist. A crew of spirits. A ship condemned to sail forever. But the Mary Celeste was never that. Her true story is quieter, more uncertain, and perhaps more tragic. She was not a ghost. She was a survivor. She survived the disappearance of the people aboard. She survived the investigation. She survived the rumors. She survived years of commercial use. She survived the transformation of her name into legend. And eventually, she was destroyed like countless other old ships. But her story survived her. That is the strange immortality of history.
People die.
Ships sink. Buildings collapse. Records disappear. But sometimes a single unanswered question can preserve something for generations. The Mary Celeste became immortal because nobody could explain her empty deck. Perhaps someday a new discovery will change the story. A document could appear. A forgotten letter. Previously overlooked record. A new understanding of the weather. A recovered artifact. History occasionally surprises us. But until that happens, the most responsible conclusion remains uncertainty. We can narrow the possibilities. We can reject explanations that conflict with the evidence. We can understand the technology of the time. We can reconstruct likely environmental conditions. But we cannot know exactly what happened. And perhaps the most honest sentence about the Mary Celeste is also the simplest. We do not know. Those three words can be difficult. People prefer certainty. They want an answer. But history sometimes demands humility. We do not know. Maybe Briggs ordered an emergency evacuation. Maybe the lifeboat separated. Maybe a combination of cargo, water, weather, and fear created a situation no one could control. Maybe something happened that modern investigators have never considered. Whatever the truth, the people never returned. And the ship did. That is the central image. The people vanished. The ship survived. The Mary Celeste continued to move through the world after the people who gave her meaning were gone. She became a vessel carrying not only cargo, but a question. And every time the story is told, the question crosses the ocean again. Perhaps that is why the story feels so quiet. There is no final scream, no final battle.
No final confession.
Only the gradual disappearance of certainty. The log stops. The boat leaves. The ship continues. Another vessel approaches. And an empty deck is waiting. The rest is silence. So tonight we can let that silence remain. There is no need to force an answer where history cannot provide one. The Mary Celeste can simply drift into the darkness. The Atlantic is calm. The sky above the old sea is clear. The ship moves gently with the swell. The ropes rise and fall. The wooden boards creak softly beneath the night air. There are no footsteps.
No voices.
No orders from the captain. Only the distant rhythm of water against the hull. The Mary Celeste is no longer carrying her family. She is no longer carrying the people whose lives once filled her cabins. But the memory of them remains. Benjamin Briggs. Sarah Briggs. Sophia. The sailors. Their names have crossed more than a century. They have traveled farther than the ship itself ever could. And perhaps somewhere, in the quiet spaces between historical records, there is still an image of that final voyage. A captain looking toward the sea, a family beside him, sailors waiting for instructions, a ship beneath their feet, and a horizon that seems endless. Maybe they believed they would reach Italy. Maybe they believed they would return to the ship. Maybe they believed they still had time. That is what makes the disappearance so painful. We know the ending. They did not. For them, there was only the present moment. And the present moment did not announce that it was the final one. History rarely does. The final moments of a life often feel ordinary while they are happening. A conversation, a meal, a walk, a journey, a decision. Nobody knows which moment will become the last. For the people aboard the Mary Celeste, an ordinary voyage became an extraordinary mystery. Their final known chapter was written in the Atlantic. The next page was lost, and perhaps the sea is the only place where it still exists. The waves continue to move. Currents continue beneath them. The same Atlantic that surrounded the Mary Celeste in 1872 still surrounds countless ships today. But the people are gone. The world they knew is gone. The technology they depended upon is gone. Even the ship is gone. Only the story remains. And stories, unlike ships, do not need wood. They do not need sails. They do not need a harbor. They travel through memory. One person tells another. A book preserves a paragraph. A historian studies a record. A documentary brings the story back to life. And for a few quiet hours, the Mary Celeste sails again. Not through the physical Atlantic, but through imagination. So as the night deepens, let the ship become smaller. The deck fades into darkness. The sails become silhouettes. The horizon disappears. The sound of the waves grows softer. The old brigantine moves farther away. There is no need to follow her. No need to solve the mystery tonight. Some stories are better left with a little darkness around them. The Mary Celeste has carried that darkness for more than a century. Perhaps it is time to let her rest. Let the Atlantic close over the questions. Let the wind pass through the empty rigging. Let the stars remain above the water. And let the names of those who disappeared become quiet again. Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, Sophia Briggs, and the sailors whose final moments were never recorded. May their story be remembered not only as a mystery, but as a human tragedy. A voyage that should have ended in Genoa. A family that should have returned home. A crew that should have stepped onto solid ground. Instead, history received an empty ship and an unanswered question. The Mary Celeste. The ship that never reached port with the people who sailed her. The ship that became a ghost without ever needing a ghost. The ship that disappeared into history because its passengers disappeared into the sea. And perhaps that is where the story should end. Not with certainty, not with a final theory, but with the ocean. Always moving, always changing, always carrying things beyond the reach of memory. Tonight, the waves are gentle. The wind has fallen. The horizon is dark. The ship is gone. The people are gone. But the mystery remains. And somewhere beneath the endless Atlantic, perhaps the final answer lies in silence. Good night. Let the ocean carry the story away. Let the Mary Celeste drift beyond the horizon. And let the last light of the lantern disappear into the dark.